Hey, remember X-Arm? This show was the laughingstock of the internet for a hot minute back in 2021, but I never actually watched it when it came out. Was it actually as irredeemably bad as everyone said? I set out to decide for myself by watching through the entire 12-episode series in one sitting and reported back on my experience. And if this sounds familiar to you, you're one of a very select few. Because just a heads up, this is a section of a video I made over a year ago that nobody watched, where I sat through the 10 lowest rated entries on my anime list. In retrospect, it was presumptuous of me to expect people to watch over an hour of me having a bad time watching bad media, but I looked back at this section recently and still really enjoyed it, so I thought it deserved better than to be buried 16 minutes deep right after this. In a video that, again, nobody watched. So, without further ado... Yes, they were right. It's so bad. Holy hell, I could barely get through it. For the uninitiated, X-Arm is a mostly 3D animated series produced and released by streaming giant Crunchyroll in 2021. It's based on a 2015 cyberpunk manga of the same name, which clearly learned some important lessons from Ghost in the Shell, namely that people like to look at drawings of naked women with heaps of USB cables plugged into them. As one of the distribution giant's first forays into production, it was supposed to make a splash. And make a splash it did. The kind where a guy in cargo shorts at the community pool does a half backflip belly flop from the highest diving board and takes a slightly worryingly long time to resurface. Now, sitting here in the bottom 10 with 12 episodes, X-Arm is the lowest rated full TV anime series of all time. In September 2020, Crunchyroll released a trailer for the show at their virtual Crunchyroll Expo, which showed off some really unsettling action scenes, quickly became a laughingstock, and currently has an almost 7-to-1 dislike ratio on YouTube. Nice. Natsume Akira is an average high schooler with an aversion to technology and a desire to improve himself like his older brother, but no idea how to escape his mediocre life. Then he gets hit by a truck.
Oh, I didn't know this was an isekai.
Little did I know how true that statement would prove to be. He wakes up 16 years later, in the year 2030, to find out that he's now just a brain jammed into a computer of unknown alien origin, and has to help a bunch of cops and an android named Alma save the world and stuff. A lot has already been said about the technical elements of this show, so I'll try to focus more on substance and my own personal experience with it, but I just spent over 4.5 hours of my life looking at this wretched, half-baked, whining pastiche of actual art, and there are some things I simply cannot stay quiet about, or else my very soul will rend itself from my body and shoot into outer space to make a settlement on a new planet where anime was never invented. This Uncanny Valley Matrix fight scene from the trailer drew a significant portion of the criticism at the time. Callum May lampooned it in their article, "Why Does the Crunchyroll Original Series X-Arm Look So Awful?" for example. The thing is though, after watching the whole show, that scene, which appears in episode 3, is one of the more competent ones in the entire series. After episode 3, I was already struggling. The first thing that stuck out to me was the mystifying choice to frequently put CGI characters right next to hand-drawn ones. They move in a very weirdly smooth, floaty, full 24 frames per second as if they're in a video game cutscene, while the 2D characters next to them are either animated in 8 frames per second or completely stock still, single drawings. In my video about why the 3D animation in Chainsaw Man looked so good, I talked about the techniques the animators would use to make the 2D look closer to 3D and the 3D look closer to 2D, so they would blend together to the point that you often couldn't even tell which was which. And there are plenty of other productions that have used 3D animation combined with creative tricks and effects to create some very visually appealing 2D images. Trigun Stampede comes to mind, but here it seems like they're actively doing the exact opposite and making the two styles look as different as they possibly can. And you know what? This is a world where there are humans and androids interacting with each other with conflict between the two. Using that cold, unsettling feeling that comes from the bad 3D animation could actually be a cool way to differentiate between the humans and androids if there was any logic whatsoever to which characters are 2D and which are 3D. As far as I can tell, the only pattern is that if a character appears on screen more than a handful of times, they'll make them 3D so that they can just make one character model instead of having to draw too many different frames of the character. They're so transparently just using whichever medium is cheaper easier and easier for any given element, and it feels like they earnestly thought we wouldn't be able to tell the difference. The only saving grace here is that the 2D characters are uncommon enough that it's not a constant distraction, you just get jump scared 2 to 3 times per episode. They also keep doing this really cool move where they zoom in really close on a texture, character, model, or render that clearly is not even close to high enough resolution to be able to handle such close inspection.
Look at the pixels!
I had to take a bit of a research break before powering through the rest of the series. Along with that trailer in 2020, we had found out that of the main production staff, not a single person had 1 teaspoon of experience making anime. At the helm was Kimura Yoshikatsu, a live-action director who seemed to mostly be known for a few mediocre martial arts films like Karate Girl and High Kick Girl.
アニメの制作が遠かったわけではなく、僕前職前の職場がプロダクション IG というアニメ制作会社の中の実写の監督という実写
In an interview, Kimura stated that since the project deals with a lot of 3D, they wanted someone who had experience with live-action films, so I was approached by the producers and I decided I'd come on board. A statement that makes absolutely no sense. Just because 3D animation is in 3D space, that doesn't mean it's not still animation. The animation studio Visual Flight was equally inexperienced with anime, or even animation itself, with their main claim to fame being that they had done some background work on Sekiro and a few other From Software games. And the main writer, Tommy Morton, is a ghost, an apparition. I literally cannot find a single other credit or anything to this name on the internet other than this actor from the 50s, which means that this person is either the biggest genius in all of this because they saw ahead of time what a train wreck this project would be and made up a pen name to go completely incognito mode, or he's just literally some guy they grabbed off the street. Both seem equally probable to me.
Future John here. I just wanted to jump in and say that, as this commenter pointed out on the original video, it was also partially funded by a taxi company for some reason. Here's one of their cars. It briefly shows up for one shot in the show, and here's an ad they made featuring Alma. They must have been really proud of this because it's still one of the 4 scrolling banner images on their website. Absolutely bizarre.
You know, I kind of get what they're going for in a lot of these action scenes, particularly that one from the trailer, and you can see that there was at least some skill in the action choreography that went into this. If you put yourself in the mindset that you're watching a live action movie, some of the simplest shots are kinda cool here. If this was a fan animation modeled and animated by a single rambunctious teenager, it would be mildly impressive. Apparently, Kimura took a full live action approach, directing these scenes with actors in motion capture suits, thinking that would make something, quote, extremely realistic. It's insane to think that you can just capture some motion capture data from a real life actor, paste it onto your highly stylized anime character models, and call it a day. As I'm sure the crew quickly found out, you still have to do a lot of manual keyframing and stylization to take that raw data and make it into something that's actually visually appealing. Completely unequipped to do so, they make do with some really basic keyframes where objects and body parts move simply from point A to point B, lacking any principles of animation, and contrasting wildly with the very detailed motion capture data. Like in this shot, for example, Alma does some crazy side handsprings up a banister, which obviously they couldn't have an actor do in real life, so it ends up feeling like she's floating through the air with all the weightless, jerky finesse of the very earliest Macromedia Flash stick fight animations from 2005. Actually, that might be giving it too much credit. Some of those animations were sick. And this extends to the facial animation too. Hey look, if I point the eyebrows down, now they're angry. And if I point them up and open the mouth, now they're surprised. And why does this fight and every other fight in this show just take place in a big empty space? I feel like one advantage of live action is that you can more easily have your characters interact with their surroundings, but we're really getting the worst of both worlds here. Up to this point, I had been driven by the novelty of something so visually awful that I had never seen anything like it. But that novelty was starting to wear thin at this point. But there was nothing to do but dive right back in. As I started to become somewhat accustomed to the visual cacophony, what began to stick out to me more was the plot and characters. Because let me be clear, the ineptitude in the animation department is not what makes X-Arm bad. If this show had Demon Slayer, Jujutsu Kaisen, Mob Psycho level animation, it would still be an unbearable bowl of bland slop. If you took the superficial elements of Akira, Ghost in the Shell, and Psycho Pass, blended them up into a mush, wash and pasted that papier-mâché style over the feeble skeleton of a mediocre isekai, this is what you would get. Our boy Akira is your standard bland self-insert character who, upon getting suddenly teleported to a version of the world that's basically unrecognizable to the version he was used to 16 years ago due to a handful of all-powerful alien devices called X-Arms, and a cataclysm in 2020 that he apparently caused but has no memory of, finds himself surrounded by a gaggle of what I assume are supposed to be pretty girls, most of whom are inexplicably in love with him basically from the moment he shows up, despite him having shown almost no personality whatsoever. Well, except for a vague desire to improve himself and do the right thing. By the way, that cataclysm in 2020 looks like this. And they're apparently very proud of how it looks because they replay this shot at least twice per episode. Being a dangerous alien cyber weapon, Akira is essentially enslaved by the Tokyo Police Department, and as he helps them defend Tokyo against a series of bland and ill-conceived terrorist attacks, he finds out that, surprise surprise, in this new world he's one of the most powerful beings in the universe and has a super hacking power that seems to just work like an invisible psychic beam that travels through the air and allows him to just take control of any machine in sight. That includes the body of Alma, the sexy pantsless android, but in order for the two to combine, Alma first has to kiss her partner Minami. No, I'm not joking. And no, they don't really even try to justify that at all. Episode 5 is a dream sequence where the crew puts Akira in a computer simulation to try to recover his memories, which allows them to play What If All These Characters Were in a High School Anime, and pokes fun at how that genre creates an unrealistic view of what high school is really like. This could have been mildly amusing, if not for the fact that the show itself is just as generic and tropey as the shows it's mocking here. Oh, Akira was once 2D and had facial expressions, apparently. I was past the halfway point now, but the further I got, the more the tunnel seemed to stretch out in front of me with no light in sight. I think my brain was starting to go a little soupy at this point because I kinda just went silent, and the only note I took between episodes 6 and 9 was that in this shot, Akira kinda looks like that Walter White meme. Pretty good joke, huh? Leave a like for that one. The show is of course underpinned by the aesthetics of the hysterical fear of AI domination that has defined the first quarter of the 21st century, but it clearly doesn't actually care about it as a theme, because when Alma gets hacked and turns evil for a bit, then gets anti-hacked back to being a good guy, and suddenly gains autonomy over her own actions and becomes a fully self-aware being for no reason, Yggdrasil, the supercomputer turned physical yandere lolly girl, unironically says she can kill a person without being ordered to, of her own free will, as if that's a good thing, and we never think about that any harder. In this instance, at least, it happened to be a bad guy that she killed of her own free will, so it's probably fine that we've invented a fully autonomous, super-powered android that now has the ability to indiscriminately kill anyone it feels like. With my brain irreparably damaged, I snapped out of my fugue state when I noticed that I was about to start the 12th and final episode. After two separate climactic battles, one against a big Akira-style blob monster made out of cables instead of flesh, the other against a bunch of digital giants that don't actually exist but sorta do and are a representation of all the evils of humanity distilled into a program, they go, "You forgot one thing, evil scientist guy. Humanity is bad in some ways, but it's also, you know, good in other ways. Haha!" and win through the power of friendship. Akira sacrifices himself to save the world, the end. Finally, let's wrap this up with a technical error and or stupid nonsensical plot contrivance lightning round. The screen is mirrored at the top because of the camera shake effect. This keeps happening throughout the show and is not a stylistic choice. They couldn't be bothered to add camera shake in the scene itself and just pasted a preset onto the rendered footage in post. This would be fine for a travel vlog, not for this. Oops, the cell shading filter decided to make the science lady's mouth disappear. This guy has a super smelling power because he's from the desert. The perspective here is all wrong, making the characters look like they start tiny and get bigger as they walk towards the camera. Oops, we broke the 180-degree rule. Akira goes all Evangelion at one point when he controls a battle bot and has to be rescued by boobs, but the risk of him losing control just never comes up again. I knew what I was getting into here, but it didn't make it any less painful. I thought about doing doing a bit where I would sarcastically defend X-Arm and pretend it's a masterpiece, but I realized that not only is that an overdone bit, but also that I don't think I could physically bring myself to do it. As a production, this was ill-advised, rotten to the core, and never should have been made. The animation is obviously the most egregious affront to humanity, but there are so many other things wrong here that I didn't notice until now that I somehow forgot to mention that the editing is horrendous, often leaving full-second pauses between every single line of dialogue.
その招待状です。
これが届いた参加者は X アームを求めて
And that there's just permanently an infuriating realistic haze filter, or 3, pasted over the screen for about 80% of the show, which moves with the camera and covers up as much of the awful CG characters as they can get away with, because they were clearly embarrassed with how this turned out. But that just begs the question, why did you release it? The only conclusion I can come to is that the intended viewing experience for this show is to get cataracts so that all you can see is a blurry, partially obscured mess of colors. I took a quick look at the manga to see if it's any better, and while it probably technically is, characters' backstories and motivations certainly seemed better fleshed out, and the art is pretty good, obviously light years ahead of the show. It still seems to be built on that same generic papier-mâché skeleton I mentioned earlier, and is even more horny. Both Alma and Minami's shirts accidentally happen to get ripped open in the first couple chapters, for example. As I sit here in a tepid puddle of regrets for having ever thought this was a good idea, my only solace is that everyone universally recognized that this was one of the worst pieces of garbage in the history of the medium, and for that, I am thankful. Anime fans, for once you were right on this one.
Thanks for watching. And thanks so much to my lovely supporters on Patreon, who are always kissing and smooching each other to summon their magical powers. Smackintosh, Scorpiante, Katie L, Serialile, Leia Pico, Nutaf, Patrick Davison, Arborix, Jun, Dr. Yola McSwag, Grav G, Squidgoo, Joe, Fuggle Nugget, Annie, Sammy Z, Nozomi Corgi, and Machu Stepek, as well as all the other names you're seeing on the screen right now. See you next time.